So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. I hope you forgive our small technical issues, which we're working on in the background. I just wanted to start with a brief introduction to Share and to the topic of the webinar, to put that in context in terms of what Share is planning to do in the next 2.5 years, and also to put it a bit in the EU policy context. So I know a lot of people that are here today are familiar with Share, but just as by way of an introduction, Share was established in 2012, although it was in our thinking from 2011 onwards. So we're approaching the 10th anniversary of the idea of Share. Share is a platform for mutual exchange and learning amongst local and regional actors working on refugee and migrant protection and integration. So we started working very much on refugee resettlement in Europe. And we've since kind of really expanded to look at integration across the piece, and particularly in the local and regional context. The kind of broad model of Share, I think, is bottom-up development, capacity building and practice exchange, mutual support and so on, and top-level advocacy. So our intensive work at grassroots level is coupled with advocacy for better integration and inclusion in Europe. In 2018-19, I should say that Share was particularly focused on building capacity for welcome and integration, smaller communities and rural areas, rural territories. This was particularly in the context of the general situation in Europe since 2015 or from 2015. And also to kind of recognition of the role that those smaller and more rural communities were playing in welcoming refugees, the long-standing role they have in welcoming migrants. So that was the focus of Share in 2018-19. So just in terms of the Share network in this period, you can say from our kind of collective experience of the last 9 or 10 years, we've developed some key principles and approaches that are really born of kind of the knowledge and the information and our experience of working with stakeholders at the local regional level. And the key approach for us, certainly in terms of engaging smaller and rural communities in integration and supporting refugees and migrants, are territorial approaches, by which we mean evidence-based and a kind of evidence-based multi-stakeholder engagement model of providing for welcome, integration and inclusion in a particular territory. So here our model is very much kind of mainstreaming integration support and providing specialist support for newcomers and for vulnerable groups. I would dare point to our response to the Integration Action Plan that was recently launched by the European Commission, and which I'll talk about later, in which we urge really we welcome multi-stakeholder engagement, of course, and multi-level governance as kind of effective approaches for good integration and inclusion. But we also urge there a continued focus on support for newcomers and for vulnerable groups within that, particularly those arriving via dedicated protection programs. I think what we're doing now, Share, is in as many other networks. We're thinking about how to really consistently mainstream refugee participation across all of the activities and partnerships of the network. So Share has made a great deal of effort to have refugees participate, particularly in Share, since the network was established. We have kind of ongoing partnerships with refugee and migrant-led organizations. We had a refugee resettlement ambassador program, which provided training, capacity building, and invited ambassadors to take part in discussions at regional, local, and national and EU level. And we've consistently involved refugees as speakers and discussants in our activities. I think what we want to do now is to make that more consistent and more meaningful. And I think that's a kind of common theme across lots of networks and organizations working in this area at the moment. So in terms of the coming period, Share is undertaking a renewed mapping of practices, stakeholders and networks and integration. So kind of a consolidation of our knowledge, but particularly in the context of the current COVID-19 situation. So we're mapping and assessing practices.
Rachel, you speak too loud, and not loud enough and too fast. And the interpreter in French asked you to slow down. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem. I can do that. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah. So Share in 2020 to 23. I was talking about the situation currently with COVID-19. So SHARE has been mapping and assessing practices that have been developed in response to that new health situation in the context of integration and inclusion. You have, I think, 3 more days to respond to our survey, which is linked from our website, to submit your practices, your ideas, and your feedback about how the situation is currently, and what practice is happening that you would like to highlight in the context of SHARE. Particularly relevant for today are the last 3 bullet points here for SHARE's activities in the coming period. So we're extremely interested in a co-creation and participatory approaches for integration. So we see that in many European countries, co-creation approaches are used very often in social care sectors, in the health sector, but they're perhaps not so well used in integration. So there are some examples of good practice, and we'll hear many of them today in the agenda. But we want to see a kind of a more consistent approach, and a more consistent use of these types of approaches and integration. We think they could be of great value. And we also consider that in terms of territorial approaches, participatory and co-creation approaches can really support kind of solid cooperation frameworks that involve all relevant stakeholders. And of course, our interest, particularly at the local level and the regional level, is that refugees, migrants, and host communities are involved in developing, implementing, and evaluating integration policies and programs. Our top level advocacy, of course, we'd advocate for the inclusion of participatory approaches in relevant EU policy and funding instruments. And particularly within the next period, we'll be developing and piloting these approaches in partnership with actors in smaller and rural territories. So again, the evidence-based approach. So in terms of our EU integration policy and funding, as I mentioned before, there is a new EU action plan for integration and inclusion, which will cover the 2021 to 27 period. So it's a substantial period that this plan will be in place for. In terms of participation within that plan, there is, I would say, some really encouraging signs and some really encouraging ways in which participation has been highlighted in that document, and so in the kind of policy thinking at the EU level. So we see there a very clear statement, which has always been there since the Common Basic Principles, actually, but now it's much better outlined. I would say that migrant participation and refugee participation in consultation and decision making, in policy making, and in developing integration programs and activities makes policies and programs more effective, more responsive to actual needs. The plan really emphasizes multi-stakeholder cooperation for integration, especially at local level involving migrants, refugees, and host communities, which is precisely the type of work that SHARE will be undertaking in the next period. The plan also commits some EU financing to build the capacity of public authorities, national, regional, and local level, to involve migrants and migrant organizations in decision making. So that support is there, the financial support is there from the EU level. The plan also reiterates, I would say, that migrants and migrant organizations should be involved in the design, implementation, and evaluation of all integration and inclusion policies and programs. I mean, this is ambitious. There is an existing requirement that this type of involvement happens in EU funding programs. But the recommendation in the plan is that should be across the piece, regardless of where funding comes from. In terms of funding, we are now at the start of a new, or just coming up to the start of a new multi-annual financial period in the EU. So the new Asylum, Migration, brackets and Integration Fund for 2021-27 has been politically agreed, and the technical agreement is pending. At the national level, national authorities are preparing the national programs for the coming period under the AMIF, and also under other EU funds that support integration and inclusion, particularly the European Social Fund and others. We see, I think, that the partnership principle at national level is not always consistently applied. So there should be the involvement of a wide range of stakeholders in preparing national programs. So for those working at national level, I think now is the time to be asking the questions about what's happening with developing those plans and who is being involved and who is being consulted. I just wanted to draw your attention here to the statement at the bottom of the screen. This is from a civil society and UNHCR advocacy statement on the AMIF. just before the political agreement was reached, saying very clearly that refugees and migrants really are the kind of prime observers of how integration policies and programs work, from the EU level, at the national level, or at the local level. So there's a kind of a wealth of experience and a wealth of knowledge that's there that really would help to effectively program EU money and also national money, local money, whichever resources it is, and to make those interventions more responsive to needs and much more cost efficient. So in terms of today's webinar, before I hand over, so our objectives today, I think this is really the first step in SHARE's program of work in this area for 2021-23. So what we want to do today really is to share good practices and lessons learned in implementing either participatory or co-creation approaches for refugee and migrant integration. And we also want to hear in the course of presenting our practices, what the key considerations are when implementing these types of approaches with refugees and migrants, as distinct from other sectors. The initial conclusions of today's webinar will be published in early 21. That's alongside the outcomes of the survey and our broader research and mapping on integration during the COVID-19 period. And the key conclusions today will really act as a basis for our activities and our advocacy during 21 to 23. I think what we found is when we began kind of researching this particular area of practice, there is a lot of good work that's happening. And then what I hope we will be able to do is hold another webinar, another discussion, and hopefully highlight some of those practices that weren't on the agenda today. So I think that's all I wanted to say about share for now, and I will unshare my screen. And maybe I will hand over then to our colleague, Sophie.